Got it. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, and thank you for attending this workshop this morning. I will actually go ahead and hand it over to two gentlemen who are part of our Center Network Area Development Specialist team, and they will be guiding you through this presentation today. I've got Mr. Vitale, based out of San Francisco, and I've got Mr. Ross, and he's based out of Vancouver, British Columbia.
Great. Thanks, Teddy. So thanks everyone for attending. Today we're going to go through, as you can see, successfully transferring your Kumon Center. I do like to sort of set it up, like the beginning idea is that I see this more as we're all sitting in the same room together, just kind of chatting. So as Teddy said, keep your mics off just to keep out background noise. But if while I'm going along, if you've got a question that's really bugging you right then, just go ahead and ask. You can just turn on your mic and ask it. Some of the staff have said if you feel a little bit shy and you put it into the chat box, somebody will mention that to me, but it's not sort of a formalized question and answer. We will do question and answer at the end, but if you have a question in the middle of things, feel free to ask that. So now it's supposed to move and it's not. Give me a second here. There we go. So I wanted to start by introducing some of the CNDD staff. So actually in alphabetical order, Marty Fish, who's been with Kumon for many years. He's actually based in Dallas, but he handles essentially the Phoenix office and parts of the Pacific Northwest since the Seattle office was merged. Actually, he doesn't do those. He does the old Phoenix office. Next is Vitaly Stelmashenko. He's based in San Francisco. He does basically the Pacific Northwest, including Alaska and Hawaii, and the northern part of California. And then last and probably least is me, Ross Story. I'm based in Vancouver, as Teddy said. I handle Southern California. If you're wondering why is this Vancouver guy doing this, by the way, I actually started Kumon in 1989. I've been based in Vancouver for all of that time. You may remember Stelshu from, who was based in Phoenix, retired last year. I've switched into his old role in the Southern California. So that's why I'm here and that's who I am. If you have any questions like that, we'll be happy to follow them up. So today, what we're going to do, we're going to review the transfer process, basically. Take a look at sort of when you start the transfer, there's an actual site review. We have to approve the transfer. We're going to look a little bit at the financial documents that you're expected to have available when you start your transfer. And some of the documents you're going to receive today. Now, these should be available for download through the chat. They're also available through me. If you, after the presentation, I'm happy to email these to you. But all of these documents are quite important or valuable, I would say, to learning more about how a transfer actually goes. Of all of them, the transfer guidebook and application form is probably the most useful. It has a lot of details. Pretty much every time we do a transfer, if anything goes wrong, we add a new paragraph or a new section in there. So it's got a lot of the kind of do's and don'ts and the things you should be aware of as you want to successfully transfer your center. So taking a look at the transfer process itself, it starts out by submitting your application. So once you've decided, hey, I really want to sell your center, some people will just tell their field consultant. That doesn't really count. It actually has to come in as a formal application, and that's the document I highlighted before. Once we get it, the field staff will actually review the center itself. They're going to check out to make sure that it meets Kumon standards, that if it needs new branding or the signage isn't complete or maybe the carpets are damaged, those kinds of things. They're going to check it out to make sure that it's either ready to go or what needs to be changed. And they'll actually provide you with a list of what needs to be changed. Then the application itself comes in with that site evaluation and the application. The branch will then, generally the branch manager will review it and decide whether he approves it or not, he or she approves it or not. At that point, they will write you a tentative letter of approval, or tentative approval letter. Now the reason we say tentative is that we have no objections to you trying to sell it, but we don't guarantee that the person you want to sell it to will be approved. So we've only approved your half of it. That's why it's called tentative. Then there's the buyer identification and qualification. So that's where the CNDD guys come in. That's basically a big core of our job, is trying to find a buyer or having you find a buyer, and then we have to make sure that they meet all of Kumon's criteria in order to become an instructor. Once we found that person, we're happy with them. We introduce the two people, like you, the buyer and the seller. Beginning of negotiations happen and we host that for you. You're going to want to get, the goal of that initial negotiation is basically to agree on the price, just the selling price, and to put that in writing. That doesn't have to even be the final price, but it's the price that we need to get you or get the buyer into training. So the tentative letter of approval, excuse me, the tentative approval letter that I'm talking about, that's kind of the big key. Until you get that, you can't actually sell. And the one other part about that tentative letter of approval is that you're going to need to also then be approved by CNDD, which is our department, and we need to make sure that you've also got all of your financials in place. I'll talk about that in a little bit too. So once we've identified the buyer, we put you guys together in a room. You're going to negotiate on a price. We do that first three-party meeting that I talked about where you're negotiating and agreeing on a price. The ideal state after that, once they get registered into training, within the next 2 weeks, we want to have a transfer agreement ready to go to be approved by Kumon. So the transfer agreement, so you know, is basically the purchase and sale agreement. It's the contract between the buyer and the seller saying this is the center for sale. We like that to be finalized, gone to Kumon Legal within the first 2 weeks of getting the buyer registered into training, and then we like to have that final draft come back, any changes needed, get it finalized and totally ready to sign condition, not actually signed but ready to sign by the time that the buyer gets into training. So that between registering them and getting them into actual first day of training is typically about a month. So the first 2 weeks you're preparing the document, the next 2 weeks you're finalizing it, and it should be ready to sign. It's a lot of talk there. Then of course the buyer will attend IDP. They've actually started attending a bit of IDP, instructor development program, or the training program, before even like as soon as they're registered. I'm sorry, could you guys, if anybody's on, I'm getting some crosstalk, so if you can just mute yourselves, that would be great. I may be able to mute you. All right. Sorry about that. So, yeah, once the buyer is attending IDP, they're actually doing some pre-training before they even get in, and then once they do actually go to training, when we say attends training, that means when they go to 101, which is a sort of an in a training room type of idea. There we go. So the second three-party meeting happens after 101, typically about a week or the week after 101. So the buyer has gone through that initial training. Their head's all stuffed full of Kumon. Now we're going to finalize some of the dates that we put in originally. So when they first started to get into that three-party meeting, the first three-party meeting, we're going to establish some basic timelines, things that have to get established and accomplished by certain dates. There's going to be a check-in on the second three-party meeting, typically with the branch, usually a field consultant or field consultant specialist, to make sure that everything is on track. Discovery Day is the sort of last thing. So Discovery Day is when all of the training is completed, they've met all of our requirements, the lease is ready to sign, the purchase and sale agreement is ready to sign, all of that's ready. Discovery Day is kind of the big welcome to Kumon. You guys may remember it. We welcome you to Kumon, and that's the day when we actually have the buyer sign his or her franchise agreement. The transfer of center typically will take around, like usually within 6 weeks of that, but I like to point out to people that the moment that the instructor or the new instructor signs the franchise agreement, essentially they will be the owner of your center, but they're not the owner yet. The actual transfer date quite often is like 6 weeks later. There's some things that have to happen in between, so we do establish all of those dates as well. So I want to go back to the review of the center by field staff. So once your application comes in, a bunch of stuff happens, but the field consultant or the branch gets alerted that you're interested in selling your center. So they're going to send a staff member out to check out your center and see if any changes need to be made, anything needs to be fixed. Sometimes if you're in a non-commercial space, you're going to have to relocate entirely. So those are the things that we're establishing to make sure that it's in a sellable condition for the buyer. So if there are changes required, we will establish, or we like to establish early on, who's going to make those changes. So I often say it's sort of like a home inspection if you're selling your house. The home inspector comes in and he might say, okay, well, the roof is fine, but the HVAC needs to be repaired in another 5 years. Those sorts of things. We like both sides to know that, and we like then to establish, okay, is the seller going to fix this before the sale, or is the buyer going to fix this after the sale? We do establish that early so that it's clear during that negotiation process, and obviously that will affect the price in the negotiation as well. There's also a CMS database review and site approval. So the database review is more digging in and making sure that your student records are all in good shape. Again, a field staff will be doing that, and again, the site approval is part of that the final approval process. So that's an ongoing thing. There we go. So the most typical case is that the site is approved. There's two possibilities. The site could be approved for sale, or the site could not be approved. So if it's approved for sale, it's the typical case. It's more it's more common to have this, but there may still be some changes required. So those will be listed up. You know, maybe the carpet's torn or the paint is out of date or those sorts of things. We also will want to confirm your lease expiration date. That's super important for buyers. They're very when they're buying a location, they want to know that there's stability there. So we'll be very interested in when the lease is expiring. The new buyer is going to have to come in with a 5-year lease. So there's some different options on how that happens. The best way is for the new guy to come in and start a new lease with the landlord. And I will say, there's a lot of different times I could talk about this, but one of the mistakes I've seen a lot of instructors make is they think, okay, I've got a 5-year lease, I'm going to wait until there's just a year left and then I'm going to put my center for sale. In my experience, most landlords, if you just signed a new lease, they're quite happy to sign a new lease with a new buyer whenever you've got them ready, because the landlord's view is, I want my money. I want my rent every month. If you provide them with a new tenant and say, here's somebody who's going to keep paying the rent every month, they're more than happy to tear out the old contract and write the new one. So I would say keep that in mind. Don't try to time it so that I'll start selling a year before my lease is up, and that way everything will be fine. Because if it takes a year to find your buyer, you're going to be in a kind of a difficult situation. We can talk about that later if you have questions. The lease and the completed lease review form need to be sent to the legal department for approval prior to signing. So the important thing to remember is there's the two big legal documents that are going to be involved is the lease, either a transfer of the lease or a new lease for the buyer of the location, and the sales and purchase or the transfer agreement. Both of those need to be checked out by Kumon to make sure that there's nothing in there that works against Kumon rules or that implicates Kumon. For example, a landlord quite often will try to put in, this is a lease between ABC Landlord and John Smith Instructor and Kumon USA Inc. or Kumon International. They try to put Kumon in on the lease as a way of making sure that if you don't pay, Kumon will continue to pay the lease. Our lawyers are going to make sure that that doesn't happen because we can't be on every lease. So the assignment or sublet, there's a new 5-year lease is the best one. Some of the reasons is that we want the lease to line up with each franchisee's franchise agreement. So it's a 5-year franchise agreement, 5-year lease. They're all kind of nicely sort of synchronized. If it's a 3 years left on the lease and then you got 2 years, it just gets a little bit more complicated. However, there are cases where you may have to do a lease assignment, in which case the lease assignment is basically I scratch out my name and I write in the buyer's name and he starts paying the rent next month. I mean, it's more than that, but that's basically the idea. So he just picks up paying where you were. A sublease is a little bit different. That means that you continue to pay the lease and then you collect money back from the buyer, and he's basically a subtenant of you, but the contract is still between you and the buyer and the landlord. Neither of those is ideal. The lease assignment for timing reasons is not ideal. The sublease has all sorts of liability issues and it keeps you attached. So in either case though, the general manager needs to approve that. He approves a lot of stuff anyway, but this is one of those cases where he would have to say, yes, that's all right. Also that the landlord, typically in any kind of a lease assignment or in a sublease, the landlord still has to say that's okay because it's still his building, it's still his property, so he has to give permission. So we won't allow any of these kinds of transactions unless we actually see documentation of that. And that's one of the things why we submit everything to our legal department, is they're making sure that those things are done. So the key point is involve your landlord early. I would say from the day you send in your application for transfer, you should also be talking to your landlord saying, I'm looking to find a buyer for my center. What are your feelings about writing a new lease with the person? Are you comfortable with that? It's important to get them involved. And as I said, most landlords in my experience are more than happy to say, oh, well, I'm sorry to lose you. You've been a great tenant, but yeah, I'd be happy to have that. And in his mind, he's thinking, I get to have my rent every month. That's what he wants. So the other possibility is that the current site is not approved. Like maybe you're on the old model and you're in a community center or church basement, that sort of stuff. If the center is required to relocate, then we have to decide who's going to do it. Is the seller going to relocate and then sell, or is he going to sell the idea of the center, but the buyer's going to have to relocate immediately upon taking over. I have to tell you that's not as an attractive prospect for the buyer, because that's sort of like you're buying a house that needs to be torn down and build a new house. It just feels like there's a little bit of extra work for them. If the buyer is going to be relocating, that's obviously going to have a huge impact on your price, but it also will have an impact on their willingness to even look into it. So be aware of that if you do have to relocate. The new location will have to be a commercial real estate a retail space, typically ground floor, 1,000 square feet. We also will want a 5-year lease. We need primary signage, sort of a typical the way Kumon centers look now. We need all of those aspects. The space itself. So first off, if you're going to have to be relocating from your current address, the new address has to be within a certain distance of the existing one. It has to be a reasonable distance that you're essentially still servicing the same neighborhood. If it gets too far, then essentially you're in a new expansion area, and that has different rules about it. So we first have to agree that this is the area that we are looking for the space, and then the actual physical site itself, the unit that they've identified, will also have to be approved. So all of those things, again, will need to be sent, like the lease and the review quest. All of that has to be sent to the Kumon legal department before we would approve the sale of the center. So the new location has to be figured out before we would let you sell the old one. Okay, so some of the things we can do to help you once you've decided, you sent in your application, the branch has reviewed it, they've given approval. Now we're going to be starting to find you an applicant. So one of the things we can do is put your center for sale up on our website. I really recommend that. Some instructors prefer not to, but it's sort of, again, like if you're selling a house but you don't want to put a for sale sign on the lawn, it's really hard for people to know that it's for sale. So that's one of the places when people are looking for a Kumon Center, they go to kumonfranchise.com, they look at our website, we've got like a map and everything. If they don't see you there, they won't even think that you're for sale. So that does limit your buyers quite a bit. We can make a letter to send to your parents announcing your center for sale. And we can make, the letter can be sort of, hey, this center is for sale, or it can say, oh, by the way, there's some centers for sale in the neighborhood. Talk to me if you're interested. And then when they talk to you, you can say, actually, it's this center. Anyway, we can craft that, and keep in mind that a lot of our best, or the best candidates for takeover instructors are actually from your existing parents. It's amazing how often I've had centers sell and then being contacted by a parent saying, I had no idea it was for sale. I would have bought it. And the poor instructor's been trying to sell it for 3 years, and they had the potential buyer sitting amongst their parents this whole time. So your parents are a resource. I would say, you may be nervous about scaring them, but they're certainly a resource you should look into. In that same line, we can do a franchise seminar in your center, or we can also do it online for the center. That's one of the options as well. But basically that would be somebody like me or Vitaly or Marty presenting sort of what the Kumon method is like, what the franchise is like. Basically the same idea as any new franchisee, but it'll be very specifically catered to this center. We can also do a franchise poster that you can hang in your waiting room, and that tends to be a little bit more generic, so it'll be the sort of thing that they're interested in maybe starting a franchise of their own, and then through that they will find out that your center's for sale. This one we say we actually do this anyway. We run a database query for any candidates in the area, so all of us are getting queries every day that are interested in Kumon, and they're from all over the country. So what we can do is actually isolate where your center is, where the typical draw area is, and go for the last couple of years, people who have inquired about Kumon. Maybe at the time there was nothing available, but now your center is available, so we can send out emails to them saying, hey, you should know that the ABC Center is now available. This is the important part, is that ultimately it's the responsibility of the seller to find the buyer for the center that's satisfactory to Kumon. I know that sounds kind of mean, but the idea is that our jobs as recruiters, it's important that you know that we're not working for you like a real estate agent trying to sell your house. We're not getting a commission. Our job is to work for Kumon and find really good quality instructors or applicants that will become excellent Kumon instructors. So that's our goal, is to make sure that the kids have a nice smooth transition, they're getting the best instruction possible. If you want to sell your center, then that's what you're doing. Like I often say, we're all walking down the road together. So you want to sell your center, you want to retire and reap some benefits from that. The new guy's coming in, his dream is to become a Kumon instructor. He's always wanted to do that, and here's his chance to step into a center that's for sale. And Kumon wants to have a nice smooth transition and have all of those kids not feel any bumps in their instruction. So we're all kind of walking in the same direction at the same time, but we're just doing it together. we're not working for each other. Hope that makes sense. So potential buyers, center staff members are actually a good. Your chief assistant quite often is a good source. Like we said earlier, Kumon parents, your own family members. A lot of instructors will sell. They have kids that are now adults, grew up in Kumon, and they're actually perfect for it. It could also be family friends and local educators, all of those sorts of things. Now the important thing is, for example, you say, I really want to sell to my daughter. She's grown up in Kumon. She's great. She'll be a perfect candidate for this. What that would do was put her at the front of the line. So if you presented her to me, I would say, okay, I'm going to start the qualification process with her. But all that does is put her at the front of the line. She still has to meet all of our qualification requirements before we would allow her to go into training. And then she still has to successfully complete all of our training before we would allow her to sign the franchise agreement. So it does, like I said, we will give preference to that person, but it doesn't guarantee they're going to get it. They still have to meet all of our requirements. So that's part. And then ultimately, like I said, it's the responsibility of the seller to find a buyer for the center who's satisfactory for Kumon. But like I said, we run into lots of candidates, so we're working with you all the time, but it's kind of we're working together rather than for one another. So some of the minimum qualifications, needs to be a U.S. citizen or have a green card. Needs to have at least a bachelor's, like a 4-year bachelor's degree. Needs to meet our financial requirements. We need to see at least $150,000 of net worth, and of that, $70,000 needs to be liquid. When I say liquid, it doesn't have to be a big pile of cash, but it has to be money they can lay their hands on in, say, half an hour. It does require a full-time commitment. I know a lot of instructors, back when they started, it was only a couple of days a week. Right now, Kumon requires 40 hours a week commitment. We need to see at least 4 class days. The class hours can be no less than 3 hours. The total number of class hours per week have to add up to 14. All of those things have to be met. For, like, even if that's not what your center is now, then when they take over, they're going to have to meet all those requirements. Also, we require our franchisees to have no other outside employment or any kind of other investments. Well, they can have private investments, but they shouldn't be running another business or having any outside employment. We want them to be 100% committed on Kumon. They need, obviously, a good understanding of the area and the community. As you know, Kumon is kind of a community-based service, and it's one of those things that they should be able to connect with their community. They need to also obviously be proficient in math and reading. We do check that out. They don't have to be perfect, but they need to have the basic aptitude. Really need to have excellent communication skills and interpersonal skills. Remember that a lot of what they're doing is not just planning the worksheets, they're interacting with the parents, keeping the kids motivated, that sort of stuff. They also need a commitment. This is kind of funny, but a commitment to helping children in the community. I often ask people, like, do you like children? It seems silly, but it's one of the key things to being successful in Kumon. And of course, dedication to Kumon's core values. So that's the stuff that the recruiters are looking for. Some of it is a hard sort of yes or no, like you have this much money or you don't, you pass the test or you don't. The other ones, like commitment to helping kids in the community, that's what we kind of go digging for and evaluate our candidates. So the buyer qualification, we start with either the seller, like you, presenting a candidate, or we have identified a candidate through our database. Once we've identified one of them, the first step for any person coming into the Kumon system is they need to attend a Kumon franchise seminar, or they need to watch. We have a recording of it as well. But that kind of spends about an hour explaining Kumon, the Kumon method, the history of Kumon, what's involved in the qualification process, the training process. We kind of go through all of the steps of what it takes to become an instructor. So it's actually a requirement for them, but it's also very educational for them. Once they've seen that, they're excited about Kumon, they send in their application. We'll go through several assessments. One of them is the math and reading test, so they have to meet our minimum requirements on that. We do a writing sample, just about a half-page essay, just to make sure that they have competent writing abilities. We screen their financials. This is where I need to see that they have $150,000 net worth, of which $70,000 is liquid. Now, everybody has to hit that, but we also need the finances to meet the selling price of the selling instructor. So if you're asking for $10 million and their net worth is $155,000 and they've got $71,000 liquidity and that's it, they'll never get any more, I'm not going to put you in the same room with that person because there's no way you're going to be able to negotiate that. But if you were asking, and again, 10 million was a crazy number, but if you were asking, and I'll use another crazy number, but if you're asking 500,000 and they have 450,000, it looks like, or I think probably they could go to a bank and get that kind of a loan if they had an agreement with you. Again, it's not a perfect science, but the idea is that we don't want to waste their time. We don't want to waste your time. So if it looks to us in our assessment that they have a reasonable chance of coming up with the money that you're asking for, or the two of you reaching an agreement, we'll put you in a room together to start negotiations. We also do a background criminal check. There's actually two of those. So we do a background check during the screening process, and then also when they get registered into training, they do an FBI criminal check, an actual fingerprint check. We also do quite a few interviews. There's actually two interviews by the recruiter. One's kind of a short version by phone, and then there's a much more in-depth one face-to-face or on Zoom. And then finally, there's a general manager interview where we present in this case, Angela's, we'll give her all of our information, what we know about the person, sort of insights that we have. Most of us have been doing this for a long time, so anything we think might be, the field consultant should look out for this, but this part I think is good. Then the general manager will then go through the interview herself and make a decision about whether we want to accept this person for your location or not. Assuming that they have said yes, then we start the initial training. So I kind of went through that a little bit. There's an initial meeting. You guys have to agree on a price. Once you've agreed on a price, we register the candidate into the next available IDP or Instructor Development Program. That person still needs to pass all of that. So there's still a possibility that they get in there and they can't pass. Sometimes they're not as good as we thought they were. Sometimes I had a lady who got pregnant in the middle of training and she just couldn't complete it. So these sorts of things happen. So be aware that if they can't complete training, then you're not going to be able to make the sale, because without a franchise agreement, they won't be able to buy the center. Okay, so this is an important one. The sales price, emotional versus factual. So the thing is that every seller wants to get the best price possible. That's reasonable. You've built up this nice business. I mean, it's emotional in the sense that a lot of these kids you've known since they were little. They didn't know how to read, and now they're graduating university kind of thing. There's really an emotional attachment to it. So we understand that you want to get the best price possible. On the other hand, the buyers, most of them, this is their first business. They've never bought a business. So they were like you when you first started. They're kind of excited by the idea of being an educator, being a self-employed business person. They didn't know they could do that. Kumon's kind of the answer to their dreams. But otherwise, they're not. This is kind of terrifying to them. This is the first time they bought a business. So they need hard data that makes sense. It can't be like, if you're saying, I want $1 million for my center because the kids were really cute when they were little and now they're big and I love them a lot, that's not the kind of decision that they're going to be able to, or that's not the kind of data they're going to be able to make a decision on. They need stuff that their accountant can look at and say, yes, that's a fair price, or no, that's not a fair price. So that's the kind of stuff that you should be thinking about presenting. But the most important thing to remember is that whatever you can sell the center, ultimately it's what the buyer's willing to pay. If you don't have a buyer, you can't sell the center, and if the buyer's not willing to pay your price, you can't sell the center. So that's the first thing. Now, if the buyer's only willing to pay this amount and you're only willing to take this amount, then you may say, okay, I'm gonna keep running the center. I'm gonna look for another buyer. That's completely okay, but keep in mind that the simplest thing for the buyer to do is nothing. So if they decide not to buy your center, it doesn't change their life appreciably at all, but it does hamper your goals to sell your center. So be aware of that when you're thinking about first setting your price, and then when you're negotiating, that make sure the price is reasonable. We generally say talk to a professional and get a price that he thinks talk to your accountant and have him give you a price or a valuation that he thinks another accountant just like him would look at and say, yeah, that's a fair price. And then typically that accountant will come back low, and you typically go a little bit high, and then you negotiate to the middle price. So some of the things you should be thinking about sales price. Now, the first thing is that you need to be selling on your first face-to-face meeting, that first three-party meeting. You should have your profit and loss statement, your tax returns. You should have all of that data ready to go. One of the big killers I've seen for these kinds of negotiations is the instructor comes in, says, yeah, I'll have it all ready. And then when they show up, they say, oh yeah, it's not quite ready, I'll have it ready in a week. And then a week goes by and they say, oh yeah, no, 3 weeks I'll have it ready. And 6 weeks I'll get it ready. And then the buyer walks away because they're not feeling confident. So having good, clean, ready to go financial documents is one of the first litmus tests. That's the first touchstone for the buyer. If they see that, even if they don't understand what's in it, if they see that it's nicely prepared, that sets a tone for how seriously they're going to be taking you as a seller. We also recommend that you have 3 years of tax returns if the buyer requests it. Like I said, the buyer is probably going to an accountant. The accountant may ask for those, it may not. If the accountant asks for them, we suggest that you provide them. There's some more stuff about Schedule C's and SEs in there. I don't understand, I would say talk to your accountant about it. You should know that if your price can't be justified by the hard data, it may be very difficult. Like if you say, I want $1 million for my center, and we look at it and we don't think it's going to be hard getting a buyer for that, and you say, well, yeah, I want $1 million because I really like $1 million. That's not the kind of answer that a buyer is going to, because he probably likes $1 million too, and he wants to get something that's $1 million worth. You should also know that, and this is probably the most important, you should talk to your financial advisor and ask their opinion. As I said, I recommend when you're deciding to sell your center, go to your accountant. Your accountant, in fact, may be a great bookkeeper, but may not know anything about selling a business. So you may go to your accountant and say, look, I want to sell my franchise. Can you recommend a guy who's good at this? And he may say, oh yeah, no, I'm a specialist in it. Or he may say, oh yeah, no, my friend Larry is very good at it. So first off, find somebody who knows about selling a franchise, which is a little bit different than the day-to-day accounting that you've been doing. And then you want that accountant, when you go to that accountant, you say basically, look, prepare the documents that you would want to see if you were the buyer's accountant. And that's a fairly good rule of thumb of setting a price, preparing the documentation necessary. He knows what a franchise a buyer's accountant is going to want, and he's going to prepare the stuff you need for that. Otherwise, you're just kind of making up a price, but you don't really know. So that's why I say talk to a professional. Okay, so you've met at the first three-party meeting. You've had a little chat. Sometimes it takes a day or two, but you'll come back to Kumon with a good faith price. So first, the buyer and the seller have agreed on a price, and this price is the going in price. It doesn't have to be the final price. It just means that you both said the same number at the same time. So based on current circumstances, this is what we think. 6 months from now, when the actual purchase is finalized, maybe the enrollment has doubled, or maybe it's cut in half. You may want to recalculate that. But this is at least the price that you agreed on at the beginning. So we need that in writing, and we need it from both parties. And the idea is that we don't want at the end of it to have the seller say, so I said $1 million, right? And the buyer says, no, you said $1,000. We want to make sure that you both said the same number, so we've got it in writing. No, you both said XX dollars at the same time at the beginning of this, even if the number changes later. So at that first three-party meeting, what you're going to expect, this may happen, the center tour and site requirements, this may happen at that meeting if it's done physically. If it's done, like for example, I generally run these over Zoom. So if we're doing it that way, you might want to do the center visit or the center tour a little bit ahead of that, maybe the day before. But typically this is your chance to go through and say, look at, I've got gold-plated faucets in my washrooms. I've got a nice, the storage room at the back actually has access into the back alley, so the UPS guy can come in without going across the carpet. This is a good time for you to point out a lot of the value of the location you're in, and just generally point out, oh yeah, and the office said that the carpet has to be changed, or that sort of stuff. So this would be what you'd be pointing out as well. Then with a Kumon staff member, and this Kumon staff member may be a CNDD person, like one of us, or it could be your field consultant or field consultant specialist. It depends on who's available and who's running it at the time, and each branch has its own style. But we will discuss Kumon's transfer procedures, obligations, and we agree on timelines. So that the first three-party meeting is really to set up sort of the rules of engagement and let both parties know these are the changes that need to be made. This is the timeline that we're looking at. This is how long training is going to be done. This is when we expect to have the transfer agreement first draft in. This is when we expect to have the final draft in. We try to set all of those dates up with you so that everybody kind of knows what the schedule is and knows what the expectations are. Right around this time, so probably just during this meeting or just before, we will have provided you with a confidentiality agreement. And by the way, all of the documents are available for download, and like I said, I can send them to you afterwards. But the confidentiality agreement is kind of a standard one. You can tweak it if you want to, but the important point for you guys is that Kumon doesn't require a confidentiality agreement of that person. You, as the franchisee, are giving them private documents, your financial documents, for them to take a look at. They're learning a lot about you. You want to protect yourself, so we recommend getting a confidentiality agreement signed between the two of you. If you want to give Kumon a copy, that's fine, but we don't require it, but you should require it for your own protection. The good faith price is non-binding. So the non-binding part, like I said, you may agree on a price, but maybe the enrollment changes, or maybe the person can't like, they just can't get through training. They're incapable of it. There's a lot of reasons why that price may not happen. So I often say that letter that you send us, the email, I like to have what we call a letter of intent, but there's different ways of doing it. It's stronger than a handshake, but not as strong as a contract. So it doesn't bind anybody, but it kind of documents the feeling at the time. So it's important to get it in writing, but remember that it's not binding. A good faith deposit. So a lot of instructors will, at the time or shortly thereafter, will say, I want a deposit just to make sure that the buyer's got skin in the game. We don't want to take this lightly. I will say two things about the deposit. Make it a reasonable amount. I would say an amount that's painful to lose, but not painful to present. So for example, I had an instructor many years ago. Actually, the buyer phoned me in a panic saying she's asked for a $40,000 deposit, non-refundable. There's no conditions, it's non-refundable. So in his mind, she basically said, give me 40,000. She'll get the 40,000, say thank you for the 40,000. I've decided not to sell. This is non-refundable. I'm going to Bermuda. So that's not what she meant, obviously. So I had a little chat with her. She understood. They rewrote it so that she said it was actually, I think, a $10,000 deposit, and it was not refundable if he backed out for no reason. But if Kumon wouldn't pass him, then it was refundable. If she changed her mind, it was refundable. So she made it much more reasonable. So if you're going to make it any kind of non-refundable part of it, make sure it's reasonable, and also make sure that the amount that you ask for, like a $40,000 deposit, he would have to take a bank loan to have that money sitting in escrow. But nobody's going to walk away from $10,000. I wouldn't walk away from $5,000. So make sure it's enough to be painful, but not so much that it's really painful. Okay, so then we also, during that three-party meeting, the staff members, will go through required changes to the center. So remember that letter of tentative approval. This is the point where that part of that letter is required changes to the center. This is where we go through full disclosure. We say, okay, the carpet's fine, but the roof tiles need to be repainted, that sort of stuff. We'll go through that. It's not really, Kumon doesn't care who does it, but we need to decide who's going to do it. And if the seller's going to do it, then it has to be done obviously before the sale is finished, because once the sale's finished, you no longer have the center. If the buyer's going to do it, typically they quite often can't do those changes until they take over the center. Generally speaking, we'll say that they can't get full license until those changes are done. So that's a strong motivator for them. Typically they want to get it done very fast anyway, but there's that sort of Damocles for them is that they can't get full license unless they've actually made the changes. So there is a sample transfer agreement that gets provided at this meeting. It's also provided today. The sample transfer agreement is sort of the boilerplate stuff. It's got all of the things that we know pretty much every transfer agreement has. My recommendation to people is go ahead and add to that, but I wouldn't recommend taking stuff out, because most of the clauses, like there's several required clauses that Kumon requires in every one of these things. There's other kind of standard clauses that pretty much everybody puts into one of these agreements. So we've kind of pre-filled it with those, but then there's going to be lots of different items that your lawyer and her lawyer are going to want to stick in there. So I would say go ahead and add to it, but I don't recommend pulling stuff out, because what will happen is when our legal team reviews it, they'll say, oh, well, it's missing clause 7-A or whatever, and it has to go back in. So I would just say use that as a starting point. The other thing I would recommend is if you're thinking of saving money and not using a lawyer, go ahead and do your own typing, but for sure have a lawyer look at everything that you type. They'll charge you $7 a word for typing, so I can see why you'd want to do your own typing, but make sure that they check it out, because the legal team, they will catch things that you didn't even know you didn't know. Anyway, so the seller will provide a buyer with information so the buyer can make an educated decision. This is really key. Like I said, the buyers, it's not like they're high-powered businessmen that have done this 100 times. This is their first time. They're terrified if this is the right choice or not. If they get the sense that you're withholding stuff, that you don't want to share certain things with them, that makes them nervous, makes them suspicious, and I've noticed it's one of the things that really kills a lot of deals, is that the buyer says, I can't get the information I need, or that my accountant's asking for. So when you go into the transfer process, just know that I'm going to be sharing everything freely with my people, or with my buyer. So some of the things you're going to be sharing with them: enrollment figures and student information regarding their study. So one of the things you can get provided by one of us, the field consultant, one of the Kumon staff can give you a CMF. You can also download it yourself, but the CMF gives you the last 3 calendar years of student data. That's a very powerful tool. I know that I always provide that ahead of time as a PDF, so we kind of strip out the private information, some of the more personal information out of there, but keep the raw student numbers. This is very valuable for the buyer to look at what the performance of the enrollment has been. Profit and loss statement. So obviously a 3-year, we often just call it a P&L. That's one of the key things. That's why you want to go to your accountant and make sure that that P&L is ready to go. Every buyer wants to see a profit and loss statement. That's the first thing they ask for. So if you don't have that, basically if we ask you to present one of that to us before C&D will allow you to start selling your center. 3 years of tax returns, so that's maybe like have them ready to go. And I would say if you're, for all of these things, if you've run your company like a sole proprietorship and you've kept your accounting for the Kumon Center completely separate from your home accounting, that's wonderful. If you're one of these people who mixes it a little bit and they've got a company card that they buy milk for home on, that sort of thing, I would stop that right away and think about selling your center 3 years from now, because you're going to want 3 years of very clean accounting that doesn't have any home expenses or anything else. It just has the business. That's very important, again, for the buyer side. They're going to want to see that. Assistant information. So this is another key thing when you're selling your center. What's your payroll? That's a big part of their profit and loss concept. But also, your staff are part of what they're buying. Like obviously they're not slaves, they're not really purchasing them, but the reputation you've built in the community is part of what they're buying. The skill set of your staff is part of what they're buying. So knowing how good your staff are and knowing that they're actually still going to be there once I take over is a big factor. It's one of the things that you can kind of use to increase your price too, is if you've got great staff, that's a big selling point. The lease contract. So, and if you're not familiar, CAM, sometimes you'll see 3 N's or triple net. Sometimes you'll see additional rent or TMI sometimes. But basically, you want to see the lease with what the rent is, and that'll be fixed. And then the additional rent tends to be a little bit more variable, but you should give them some idea of what they want to know, what I'm paying every month, and what I've been paying every month for rent for the last 3 years, so that they'll have a good idea of what they're going to be paying for rent for the next 3 years. So all of that, any stipulations in the rental contract, you should have that ready to go and present to them at that meeting. So we've gone through that. You guys have chatted. We went away after the 3-party meeting. You spent maybe a day. You came to an agreement. You sent me or Vitaly or Marty the letter of intent or the agreement of the price, the good faith price. So we now know that. We get the person registered into training. There's some stuff that happens, a flurry of activity. Within about 2 days, they're actually in there and the training kit is on its way to their house. So at that point, we want to have the first draft of the training agreement along with the transfer review request form, which is one of the forms we've got attached, 2 weeks after they sign their training agreement. So this is once you've agreed on the price, everything's ready to go. We register them into training. They sign the training agreement. Within 2 weeks, we want to have the transfer agreement pretty much fleshed out. Both lawyers' sides have looked at it. We're happy with it. Now it's time to send it into legal. I guarantee you legal will find something wrong with it, so they're going to send it back for a couple of changes. So typically that will go back, maybe one revision. Legal will look at it again. Hopefully by that time they'll say, yeah, everything's good in here. It's ready to be signed. That's enough. Now some people will actually go ahead and sign it at that point, but even if both sides sign it, it won't be valid until the franchise agreement is signed. So if your lawyers are going to draft that up and say, yeah, let's both sides sign this so that we're locked in, make sure that you have, talk to your lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but talk to your lawyer to make sure you have something like a subject for removal. And the subject for removal will be subject to the buyer successfully signing a franchise agreement with Kumon. So if they don't sign the franchise agreement, it doesn't matter what kind of agreement you guys have. They can't go through with it because Kumon won't grant them a franchise. So the final draft, like I said, has to be submitted before course 101. So within the first 2 weeks of signing the transfer agreement, flesh it out, get it finalized, and get it ideally signed or ready to be signed before the first day of training. And one of the reasons we want that to be done is we want to get it out of the way. This is sort of the thing that if it drags on during training, it tends to interfere with training, and training interferes with the negotiation. So get that done, because between 101 and 201, now you're going to have to deal with the lease, which is another set of back and forth with the lawyers. So try to get that done by all means before 101. This one, I'm always surprised. I shouldn't have to say it, but I will. To avoid conflict of interest, we strongly urge that each party have a separate lawyer reviewing the documents. So the only time this sort of shows up is if I'm selling to my daughter or my chief assistant. And you might say, well, I've known the guy for a long time. He's great. Now, if your lawyer is willing to represent both the buyer and the seller, I recommend both of you get a different lawyer, because that's not a good lawyer. One lawyer's job is to only look out for the seller's interests, and he doesn't care about the buyer. The buyer's lawyer's job is to only look out for the buyer's interest. He doesn't care about the seller. Same thing for the accountant. The accountant's job is to get the highest price possible for the seller. The buyer's accountant's job is to get the lowest price possible. There's no way that the same guy can do the same job for both people. So for sure, and like I said, it's usually a family connection, get a separate lawyer just to make sure that the things are done properly. It never hurts to have a second opinion, if nothing else. I like to point out too that there's a materials fee of $1,000. Now, there's a materials fee of $1,000 when you open a new center. So there's a $2,000 franchise fee. $1,000 goes in as a training deposit, and then you pay the other $1,000 plus taxes when you sign your franchise agreement. At that time, for a new center, we're going to have you pay a $1,000 materials fee, and for that you get like 16 boxes of stuff. It's enough to fully stock out a brand new center. So a lot of people say, well, a transfer, I've already got a bunch of stock. I shouldn't have to pay the $1,000 materials fee. But in fact, a lot of times those centers, they have stock, but the stock's a little old. It needs to be refreshed. So it's one of those things that we've tried different ways, but we found that no, just put the $1,000 materials in there, get all new stock into the center. It's a nice, fresh, clean start. So it will not be waived. Okay, so the second three-party meeting. Now the buyer has gone to training. They've done a bunch of homework as well. They've gone to the actual 4 days of intensive IDP 101 training. Within a week after that, and their heads are all full of Kumon, usually they're super jazzed. They're really excited about Kumon because the training department is excellent, and they like one of the benefits of it. So now we've got a very excited candidate. We're going to reconfirm the timelines. We set out some basic timelines of things that had to get done. Now we're going to put down, like, this has to be done by mid-June. This is going to be, okay, this has to be done by June 28th at 12 o'clock. So we're going to get into much more detailed confirmation of deadlines. And I will say that usually the branch staff is working with you throughout, or working with the candidate throughout. So it's not like it's all those 2 meetings. There's a lot of mini meetings along the way, pretty much on a weekly basis. Now the branch needs to confirm that the lease submission and approvals are underway, and that the seller and the buyer understand that they need to complete all of those things prior to signing the FA. So basically what we're doing is making sure that all of your legal documentation is in place, and that you've done what you need to do, and that Kumon has checked it and approved it, and it's in place. So a lot of these things are designed to kind of smooth when you're all ready, the training's done, you're ready to go. We don't have legal issues or technicality issues blocking the way. So we're just trying to make sure that the whole transfer is smooth as possible. So the last thing I always like to remind people, we said this before, the issuance of a franchise to the buyer remains at the discretion of Kumon. So there's a chance that the person's terrible in training, they just can't do it, or there could be any number of other things that happen. But if for some reason we don't think that this person will be a credit to the Kumon name and reputation, we're not going to sign a franchise agreement with them. So you need to know that no matter how much of the rest of these documents you got, there's still the potential that Kumon may say no. I will say it doesn't happen a lot, but it is a possibility. So some of the key considerations to think about, this is rare, but it could happen. If I were lucky enough to have 2 candidates ready for the center, I've qualified them at the exact same time, they're both ready to go, you can't keep going with both of them. You're going to have to decide which one you're going to negotiate with. You could informally meet with both, but once you've decided I'm going to start meeting this person, it's a 1 candidate consideration policy. So I often say it's like you're dating, and as soon as we introduce you for that 3-party meeting, now you're going steady. You can't see anybody else. So that means that while the buyer is in training, you can't be negotiating with anybody else. But also, while the buyer's in training, he can't be looking for a better deal at some other center. Once the 2 of you have come to an agreement, we've got the good faith price in writing, you're kind of locked together, and until there's a formal withdrawal, that he's only looking at your center, you're only looking at this candidate. Strong buyer-seller communication. This is, again, one of the big killers in my experience. Miscommunications or being rude, or like a lot of times if you've been an instructor for 40 years and you kind of think, well, this new guy doesn't know what he's doing. I have to say there's a lot of emotional stuff like that, but you've got to remember that you're selling the center, and you have to be positive and a good, like, make sure that you're not hiding information, that you're available for communication, you don't disappear for 3 weeks at a time, that all of that back and forth is going. Answer your emails, check your emails on a regular basis. All of that stuff is really key to the success or failure of a center transfer. This is another thing I like to remind people is it does happen that for whatever reason, you guys couldn't agree on a price. You couldn't agree, like as the training went on, you realized that you just hate this guy. You don't want to sell him at any price. That stuff like that happens. So if that happens, once we get a formal withdrawal, like we're no longer doing a deal, Kumon's not going to give up on you. We're still going to try to find you a buyer, but we're also not going to give up on that candidate. We've put some time and effort. We've already said that this is somebody who's qualified and would make a good instructor. So we may offer them some other franchise. It may be another takeover, or it may be a new location. And quite often they're in your neighborhood, so it may be fairly new to you. You should know that, fairly near to you, I should say. You should know that going in, so that you know, like, this is you're sharing information. That's why you signed the confidentiality agreement, is because even though they may know stuff about you, they can't use it. They can't tell anybody else about it. But it also means that I didn't like him, he can't buy any center. You can't actually do that. Kumon may, in fact, offer him another center. Anyway, of all of these, communication between the buyer and seller is so very important. Make sure that you're always polite, respectful, and quick responses, thorough responses, and that you're you know what I'm saying. Okay. Obviously, I'm bad at communication. So some of the responsibilities for you during this process, one is that you need to be an active franchise agreement. Like, some people will say, I want to sell my center, and if it's not sold in the next 6 months, I'm leaving. Well, there's two things that can happen. You can give 180 days notice, in which case we're not selling your center. We're looking for somebody to take over a center that's going to be vacated in 180 days. On day 181, we're going to put a brand new instructor into that center, and we're already going to be arranging the lease with the landlord, and you're going to leave, and that'll be fine. But you're not going to get any money for the center. If you want to sell the center, then you have to stick it out for as long as it takes, and it can take quite a bit of time. First, we have to find the person. Then sometimes negotiations take longer than we expected. I know people who have sold it very quickly, but I've known people that have sold it, it's taken them over 3 years to find it. So you have to be an active participant. The center has to be running. You have to be a full franchisee. You can't check out of it. The strange thing is, actually, a lot of times when people sell their center center starts to grow. I don't know why, but it's a magical thing I've noticed. You need to pay all of your royalties, all of your requirements to Kumon. During the transfer process, you and the buyer was going to have to work in your center alongside you. We call it transfer center training, or takeover ICT. It may require, like, the requirements here is that there's 6 class days and 2 non-class days, but we may actually ask for more. A lot of instructors will have the new guy working side by side, basically like an employee in the center for the entire transfer process, which is great. It gives the new guy a chance to get to know general class flow, class procedures, get to know the kids, get to know the staff, get to know the parents, and for them to get to know him. So I really recommend, the minimum is that six days of class and 2 non-class days, but the more time they spend in the class, the smoother the transition is for everybody. You need to prepare the center transition plan with the branch. Basically, we've done this a lot of times. We have some standard things that go to the parents. There's a time, you'll talk about this with the branch staff as well, but you should really think about, when am I going to tell the parents? Certainly, as soon as the ICT is finished, you should be telling them, like, at least 6 weeks before the actual transfer, but maybe earlier. When am I going to tell my staff? A lot of times you don't tell your staff right away, but they're going to know something's happening, so you're going to be wanting to work with your branch liaison as well to figure out when's a good time to start telling my staff and letting them know. You don't want them to feel a sense of betrayal when the actual notification comes out. Very few people have this, but in the old days, when the internet was new but Kumon didn't have a website, some people made their own websites. If you had one of those, that's going to have to be shut down. Very few people have that now, so I don't think it's as big an issue. So one of the things I like people to remember, transfers take time. A lot of instructors go into it saying, I'd like to sell, it's November, I'd like my center to be totally gone by January. That's not going to happen. I'm going to show you some timelines in a couple of seconds, but I would say, as a general rule of thumb, from the day you submit your transfer request, at least a year before you're free of the center, and we've got a new instructor there. Just plan on a minimum of a year if everything goes perfectly. If any little bumps in the road or you're having trouble finding a candidate, just keep on adding months and months and months to that. But your fastest turnaround time, just plan on a year. The odd time we sneak it in there a little bit under, but I'd rather you plan on a year and get it done in 11 months than plan on 6 months and find out that it's going to take a year. So just plan on that. I'm going to take a look at the training schedule just so you have an idea of what sort of things to expect. So anybody online right now, June 28th is impossible, but say you gave me your transfer form today, or you gave one of the CND guys your transfer form today. There's a good chance that you said, okay, here's my chief assistant. I think they'd be great. We go through the qualification process. Typically, I mean, it can go faster or slower, but I would budget at least 34 days for that qualification process. If we can get everything done though, and they're responding quickly, and we were able to get them registered or actually approved by the general manager, then we do the three-party meeting. Then you guys have a negotiation. Maybe you've already agreed on the price because you know each other well. That goes more quickly. You come back with that agreed upon price. We get them registered into training. If we can get all of that done by August 12th, then these are the kinds of timelines we'd be looking at. That would be cycle 9. So August 12th, we get them registered. They'd be doing their first IDP between September 20th and 23rd. And remember, by this time, you will have submitted a finalized version of the transfer agreement. Their second course will be between October 25th and 28th. By this time, the lease will be finalized. There's then some in-center training that happens, sort of starts before 201 and it goes after 201. Then there's the center, the transfer, in-center transfer training that will also be going on for several weeks. So all of that now in this particular scenario too, it's unlikely that we would be able to then open on January 1st or in January because there's a lot of stuff. So on this particular timeline, we're looking at a February 1st opening. That kind of good. I mean, that's less than a year, but that is assuming that everything went perfectly. So this is kind of your fastest possible version. And I really like people to know that. And the other thing I talked about earlier is, talk to your landlord early. Find out, like what I see a lot with instructors is they have a lease. The lease is expiring in 6 months. Let's get the sale going, but I don't have a candidate. You're now in a really tricky situation because that lease is not going to be there by the time the candidate's ready to take over. So you're going to have to think about it. If you'd started it a little bit earlier, or if you just said, I'm ready to sell at any time, the lease is going to be transferable to the new person, or the landlord's already agreed to sign a new lease, then you're in a much better position of worrying, like you're not worrying about the timing of it so much, because those lease things tend to be one of those factors outside of your control. Okay, so your next steps, once we're done today, read through the transfer guidebook. In that, it's about 5 pages of just stuff, like important stuff to know about what goes on in the transfer process. The last 3 pages are the transfer form itself. When you're ready, just fill out that transfer form, send it to either your field consultant, you can send it to your branch manager, you can send it to your franchise recruiter. We will get it going, but then the whole qualification or the approval process has to start. That quite often can take close to a month, depending on how things go. Things need to come in. One of the biggest things in terms of delaying the approval is everything's ready, the branch approves it, the center's in good shape, but we don't have a profit and loss statement. If I don't have a P&L, we won't advertise, because I said earlier, one of the big killers of any kind of agreement is if the buyer or the seller shows up without any documentation to back up their asking price, the buyers just walk away. So the CNDD, or the Center Network Development Department, essentially the people who are assigning new locations, have a policy that unless we have the P&L in hand, we need to look at it. We don't assess whether it's a good P&L or not, but that you've got it prepared and it's ready to go. That's all. We won't look at the price or anything. Like, we don't care what price you're asking. We just want to make sure that it's ready to be presented to the buyer. At that point, we would start the actual recruiting process. Review the transfer checklist. So one of the documents that's been supplied is, it's kind of a transfer checklist that we go through as staff, and it literally is like check boxes of things to think about. It's a good, makes you think about what to do. So even if you're not in the process of a transfer right now, it's kind of good to go through that and get an idea of the things that you're going to have to think about during the transfer process. So I think that's a really good document to go through. Prepare any additional financial documents. I just talked about those. Make sure that those are ready to go. Now's the time to be preparing them. Have them ready to go even before you send in your transfer forms, because that's one of the things that you're going to need anyway. Follow all the steps that are in the guidebook and then in this PowerPoint. So those are the sorts of things you're going to want. I mean, I've given you an outline here, but like I said, the guidebook has one of the things you can refer to. I don't expect you to have memorized everything. So the documents that are available, I think Angela's uploaded these to available for download from chat. If not, you can contact me afterwards. I can send these to you in an email. But these are the kind of the key things you're going to want. The last one on there is the broker letter. I'll just mention it. That's not included as the standard documents we provide. But if you said, look, I want to get a broker is somebody who goes out and finds potential buyers for franchises. And then he gets a commission. Quite often it's like 10% of the sale price. I will tell you that if you're going to use a broker, it has to be approved by us, and we need certain documents signed by them, and you basically saying that Kumon has no, we're not required to give any compensation to the broker. So that's that part. I will say though that using a broker hasn't been super effective. I wouldn't count on using a broker. Only because most brokers will say, no, Kumon's too small scale. I mean, he wants to sell McDonald's franchises for $5 million and that kind of stuff. He wants to get a big commission. Because he's getting a commission on the sale, typically the sales aren't the kind of thing that brokers are interested in. But I won't belabor that. So anyway, once again, these are the three guys that are dealing with that. Marty dealing with primarily the Phoenix office, the old Phoenix office, Vitaly dealing with Pacific Northwest and Hawaii and Alaska, and then me dealing with the Southern California primarily. So, any questions? Anybody can fire them out either as chat, or you can just open up your microphone and ask away. And I will say, if you're shy or you're feeling like this is a question I don't want to ask in front of everybody, you can also send any one of us, and I'll give our information again. You can send any one of us an email. Go ahead.
Normally, when I was in motel business before, the Midwest, it was a thumb rule that revenue times 3. In California, motels, rooms number times $1 million. Yep. Is there any thumb rule for sell price?
I've heard a million different rules of thumb, but first off, I don't know that there is a correct one. But also, as a Kumon staff member, I won't tell you. Even if I had one, I wouldn't tell you. And the reason for that is, say I told you, look, you can sell your center for $1,000. So you say, okay, and you sell your center for $1,000. A buyer comes in, pays $1,000, and then a year from now, you come to me and you say, I just found out I could have sold my center for $2,000. I hate you. I hate Kumon. I'm suing everybody. Okay, so fine. All right. So sell your center for $2,000. So you sell your center for $2,000. A year later, the buyer comes to me and says, I just found out I could have bought that center for $1,000. I hate you. I hate Kumon. I'm suing everybody. There's no way we can win. So the thing I told you way back, go to your accountant. Say, I want to know, you put a valuation on that. There's so many different valuation methods. And I would say, from my knowledge of the way the hotel industry works, it's a little different. I mean, there's fixed assets in the hotel. There's a per room generation, revenue generation. It's a little bit different model. When you think about Kumon, there's really no tremendous fixed assets involved. Most of it is goodwill. So essentially what you're selling is the revenue stream of your existing students and the potential that they'll still be there. So that's what your accountant's going to want to be looking at, and that's what the buyer's accountant's going to want to be looking at.
I don't know.
Yeah. So I'm sorry I can't. I mean, I'd love to tell you this is the answer. It's going to be X dollars per subject, but there's no correct answer for that. And even if there were, there's some centers that have tremendous retention, other centers that have terrible retention. How can I compare them? Okay. Anybody else? It's a good question.